Hey everyone, it's Lindsay and welcome back to my channel for a new true crime video. And today I'm going to be discussing a much older case. It happened back in December of 1972. And I remember this case growing up in the 80s. They had made a movie about it, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this case as well. So today I'm going to be talking about the 1972 kidnapping of Steven Stayner. And for those of you that do remember this story, you'll remember that it was a bizarre one. And in 1999, almost 20 years after Steven came home, his older brother would be convicted of murdering 4 women. So let's go back to the beginning of this story when Steven Gregory Stayner was born on April 18th, 1965 to Delbert and Kay Stayner. And Steven would be the middle of 5 children. He would have an older brother, Cary, and 3 sisters named Corey, Cindy, and Jody. Now, the Stayner family was your typical family in the 70s. Delbert Stayner, or Del as they called him, would work in a peach canning factory, and Kay was a stay-at-home mom. They lived on Betty Street in the small town of Merced, California, which was also known as the gateway to Yosemite. So Steven's family and teachers would describe him as just an all-around good kid. He was helpful and respectful and just very trusting of other people, which unfortunately was something that would get him into trouble later on. Now, Steven was just like any other boy. He loved hanging out with his friends after school. However, he did have a bad habit of staying at his friend's house till very late in the evening, to the point where his parents would get worried about him. And he would do this so often that he actually would get in trouble for this about a week before he disappeared. So on December 4th, 1972, it was a windy and cold winter day, and Kay was actually supposed to pick Steven up from school. However, she was kind of running a little late. She had to pick up some kind of part for Del. So when she got to the school, Steven was already gone. And she had just assumed he probably got tired of waiting and ended up walking home. However, when she got to the house, she would notice that he wasn't there either. But again, she really wasn't too worried. She figured he probably stopped off at a friend's house. However, this wasn't the case. So Steven would decide to walk home from school that day. However, a couple of blocks from home, Steven was approached by a man named Irvin Murphy. And Irvin would be holding these stack of religious pamphlets. And he would ask Steven if maybe his mother was interested in donating to the church. And Steven said that she probably would be interested. And this is when Irvin would offer him a ride home so that he could talk to Steven's mother. And at first, Steven would actually tell Irvin no, that he didn't need a ride. He was only a couple minutes from home and he could walk. But after Irvin asked him multiple times, Steven would finally give in and accept the ride. And that's when a white Buick would pull up with another man in the driver's seat. And this man would be known as convicted sex offender Kenneth Parnell. So Parnell had actually served 3 years for sexually molesting an 8-year-old boy back in 1952. And it is also said that he was in and out of mental hospitals and juvenile hall in 1951. Now, Parnell would go on to get a job at the Yosemite Lodge as a night auditor, and this is where he would meet and befriend his co-worker, Irvin Murphy. Now, as Parnell and Murphy became closer friends, Parnell would actually tell Murphy about his plan to abduct a little boy and raise him as his son and raise him to be religious. And Irvin was described as being kind of naive and slow-witted, so a lot of people believe that this is why Murphy would go along with Parnell's plan. So once Steven had gotten into the car, the 2 men would start driving out of Merced, and Steven would notice that they had driven past his road, and he would point this out to them. And the 2 men would say, "Oh no, don't worry about it. We're going to go ahead and call your parents and see if you can spend the night with us." And so they would drive Steven up to a remote cabin in Cathy's Valley. And what's so crazy about this is that this remote cabin was actually only a couple hundred feet from Steven's grandmother's house. But Steven was only 7 years old, so he didn't know where she lived. And the grandmother had said that she'd never seen Steven up there. So by this point, Steven's parents were actually starting to panic. They had called all of Steven's friends' parents, but nobody had seen him. So at about 5 p.m., they would call the police and let them know that their son was missing. And the police didn't wait. They would immediately start canvassing the area, and Kay and Dell would start handing out flyers. And Steven's face was everywhere. It was on milk cartons, it was on the news. And the Stayners really tried to keep his story relevant in the newspapers, but over time, the story just kind of got old and they just weren't really interested anymore. So despite all of their efforts, the Stayners wouldn't see Steven again for 7 years. So while everyone was searching for Steven, Parnell would do his best to try to brainwash him. He would keep him in a single room in the cabin for about a week, where he would repeatedly feed him this cough syrup as a way to kind of sedate and confuse him and try to make him lose any type of connection he had with his family. And unfortunately, this is also when the sexual abuse would start. After Steven had repeatedly asked Parnell when would he get to go home, when would he be able to see his parents again, Parnell finally would tell him that his parents really couldn't care for him anymore, and that he had gone to court and he was now going to be Steven's new father. And this is when Parnell would dye Steven's hair. He would change his name from Stephen Gregory Stayner to Dennis Gregory Parnell. And about a week after Steven was kidnapped, Steven would now be calling Parnell Dad. So a couple of weeks after Steven's abduction and living in this cabin together, Parnell would decide that it was time for them to move. He was kind of trying to stay ahead of the police. So he would take Steven and they would end up drifting around California for a while, staying in dirty motels and broken down houses, until he decided to enroll Steven into school. So typically when you are enrolled into a new school, they would need to get your records from your previous school. However, in 1972, things were not as strict as they are now, and they never followed up. So they never got Steven's records from Charles Wright Elementary that he attended when he lived in Merced with his family. So nobody ever suspected, nobody ever knew that Dennis Parnell was actually Steven Stayner. But isn't that crazy? Like, he enrolled him into school. Like, this was his chance to be found by somebody. He was hiding in plain sight, and nobody ever knew. 7 years, and nobody ever knew that this kid was actually kidnapped. He had friends, he had teachers, and nobody ever figured out that he was who he was. So the following year, in 1973, Parnell was dating a woman named Barbara, and he would end up moving her into the house to kind of help out and babysit Steven. Now, she was also a single mother, so she had a son named Lloyd that would actually play with Steven. And Steven would allege that Barbara had molested him on multiple occasions. And he would also go on to say that Barbara tried to help Parnell abduct another little boy from the Santa Rosa Boys Choir. However, she denies all of these claims. She denies that any of this ever happened and that she didn't even know that Steven wasn't Parnell's real son. So as the years went on, Parnell and Steven would kind of start living their new normal. And Parnell would actually get a dog, a Manchester Terrier, from his mother, and he would actually end up giving this dog to Steven. And Steven would name her Queenie. And Steven and this dog would actually get quite close, and he would end up bringing this dog with him the night that he escaped. Now, the Stayners were not giving up hope on finding Steven. However, his disappearance was really starting to take a toll on the family. Kay wouldn't leave the house for a while because she was afraid that if Steven called, that she wouldn't be there to take his call. So she would always want to make sure that somebody was in the house to answer the phone. And Dale Stayner really just kind of started to break down, and he just became very upset and very angry. He would drive around a lot looking for freshly dug ground with the possibility of it being a grave. If he seen kind of something odd in the back seat of another vehicle, he would start following them. And even Steven's older brother, Cary, started exhibiting odd behaviors. He would develop this OCD where he would pull his hair out. So he ended up having to wear a lot of hats to cover this. And he would end up exposing himself to one of his sister's friends. By 1976, about 4 years after Steven was abducted, Parnell would decide that it was time to up and move again. And this time it would be to a small town called Campsie. Now, Steven was about 13 years old at this point, and Parnell really wasn't afraid that Steven was going to run away or tell anybody, and he pretty much let him do whatever he wanted. So Steven could smoke, he could drink, he was doing drugs. But while living here, Steven actually made a few friends. He even started dating a girl named Lori, and he joined the high school football team.
My name is Lori, and Steven Stayner was my boyfriend in high school. He had a great personality. He was spunky. You could see that he wanted to play and be with kids and be normal. Growing up with him consisted of a lot of fishing, riding bicycles.
So up to this point, Steven would never tell anybody what was going on behind closed doors and never tell anybody, what Parnell was doing to him. However, he did start trusting his friends more, and he would actually make a few comments that his friends really didn't understand until years later.
We were walking home and he started crying. He said, "I want to go home to my real home." We just let it go. We have been drinking some beer and, kids.
So Parnell would see that Steven was actually getting quite close to his friends and that he was starting to build relationships with their parents and his teachers, and this would actually make Parnell very nervous. I think he was, afraid that Steven would get close enough to someone to actually tell them what was going on. So Parnell decided that yet again it was time to move. And this time he would move Steven into a 1-bedroom shack that didn't have any electricity or indoor plumbing. So Parnell would start to notice that Steven was getting older and that he wouldn't really be able to control him anymore. And he preyed on younger boys. So Parnell thought it was time to go out and abduct another little boy. Now, in the past, Parnell had asked Steven to help him, but Steven always intentionally sabotaged it or would flat out tell him no, that he wasn't helping him. So Parnell would end up hiring a teenage boy that was actually a friend of Steven's or somebody that Steven had gone to school with, named Randall Portman. And he told Randall that if he had helped him abduct this little boy, that he would pay him in money and drugs. So on February 14th in 1980, a 5-year-old boy named Timmy White would be walking home from school to his babysitter's house. And this is when Randall Portman would approach him and try to lure him into Parnell's car. However, Timmy got scared and he would end up running off, and Randall would have to chase after him until they came up to this chain link fence. Now, Timmy was upset and he was crying, and Portman would actually have to pry Timmy's hands off the chain link fence and put him into Parnell's car. they would end up giving Timmy some orange juice and sleeping pills so that he would pass out. So later that day, after Steven got home from school, he would walk into the house and he would see Timmy there. And Parnell would tell him, "This is your new little brother." Now, Timmy would be there for a couple of weeks before Steven thought that he needed to do something. He didn't want Timmy to have to go through all the horrible things that he had gone through for almost 8 years. So on March 1st, 1980, after Parnell had left for work, Steven, Timmy, and Steven's dog Queenie would set off for a 39-mile hike to Ukiah. So the boys were only walking for about a mile when a truck would come along and pick them up. And he would actually drive them all the way into Ukiah. So once they got to Ukiah, Steven told Timmy that he would need to go into the police station and give them his name. However, when Timmy got to the door, he would get scared and end up running around and start running back to Steven. However, there was a couple of cops outside when they seen this, and they would go over to the boys and start asking them questions. And Steven would tell them, "This is Timmy White." And right away, the cops knew immediately who it was. So the police would end up bringing Steven into the station to further question him. And this is when Steven would end up telling them who he thought he was. He would say, "I know my first name is Steven, and I think my last name is Stayner." And after the police kind of put everything together, they were just shocked that they were looking at this kid who had disappeared 7 years prior. And by 3 a.m., they would be knocking on the Stayner's door to let them know the news and arresting Kenneth Parnell. So when the cops got to the Stayner's house, Kay had thought that they were there because of Cary. He had been camping up at Yosemite. But when the police had told her that, no, this has to do with Steven, she basically collapsed. She thought that they were there to tell her some really bad news. But Dell, he came right out of the kitchen and he was asking them, "Well, where is he?" And this is when the cops would tell him the Ukiah police station. So when Steven would finally return home, he was not only met by his parents, but he was also met by multiple news stations that were filming his homecoming, and hundreds of neighbors that would be standing on the street just cheering him on. And people were happy for him that he was home, but they were also looking at him like he was a hero for saving Timmy White. And so Steven would end up reuniting with his parents on this street that he grew up on. And he would say that he did remember what his parents looked like, but when he met his brothers and sisters again 8 years later, that he didn't really remember what they looked like. He couldn't really recognize them.
There he is.
Steven was a national hero. He returns to Merced triumphant.
Steven's return has been a joyous event.
Within days, he's on Good Morning America.
Good morning, Steven and Mr. and Mrs. Stayner. And Steven, how does it feel to be home?
Feels great.
Did you remember your parents well?
They didn't change that much. I recognized them when I got out of the car.
What about your brothers and sisters?
They changed a lot. I never recognized either one of them.
So from that first night, Steven wouldn't really have much time to process everything going on around him in private because there was always a camera in his face. He had done multiple interviews and they were just very persistent and asking all sorts of questions that he couldn't even answer sometimes due to the upcoming trial. And Kay really begun to regret allowing those cameras to film his homecoming when they started following him to school and into the classroom. And it had gotten so bad that she had to request that they stopped following him when he was in class. So a lot of the other students would actually be jealous of Steven for getting all this attention, and even his sisters would admit to being envious of him. And his older brother Cary would actually get really annoyed that he was getting all this money and gifts and clothes. And in an interview with Cary, he would actually state that, he thought that Steven was just a normal boy and that the media was blowing it all out of proportion by calling him a hero, and that any other person that had any type of moral fiber to them would have done the same thing. Now, a lot of these feelings from Cary would also come from the fact that he was feeling neglected by his family, especially his father, because his father was giving all this extra attention to Steven, which he obviously deserved. So Cary would start to spend a lot more time up in Yosemite. So when Steven was originally interviewed by the police, they would ask him if Parnell had ever touched him inappropriately or ever abused him in any way. And Steven would tell them no. He didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want anybody to know what had happened to him in those past 7 years. And so people really believed that Parnell was just this man who had a past that wouldn't really allow for him to have a family, so that he needed to abduct a little boy so that he could have a son. However, about a month later, Steven would be called back into the police station after they had found some nude photos of Steven when he was little at Parnell's cabin. And so the truth would finally come out, and Steven would have to tell them about how Parnell had abused him for over 7 years. Now, Steven never received any therapy for what had happened to him. His father, Dell, didn't really think that he needed it, and he wasn't really a fan of therapists or psychologists, and especially not psychiatrists. And this information did not need to be out there. So on June 8th, 1981, Kenneth Parnell would finally be sentenced for the kidnapping of Timmy White, and he would receive a whopping 7 years. And when he would return back to court on December 1st, 1981, he would be sentenced for Steven's case. And since he had already received the maximum 7 years for his first offense, Timmy's case, he would only have to serve a portion of that for Steven. So he would end up getting 20 months for the kidnapping of Steven Stayner. So that would be a total of 8 years and 8 months for the kidnappings of Timmy and Steven. And because the majority of the sexual abuse that happened to Steven happened in Mendocino County and not Merced, Merced couldn't try him for any crimes. So if they did want to charge him with that, they would have to go to Mendocino County, and that would mean a second trial for Steven. And prosecuting attorney Joe Allen said that if they did, it would probably only add 2 to 3 years onto Parnell's sentence, so it wasn't really worth it to them. Now, Parnell had already served 2 years of that jail time while he was waiting for the trial to start, and he would only serve an additional 3 years in prison because they would end up releasing him early due to good behavior. So Parnell would only end up spending a total of 5 years in prison for kidnapping Timmy and Steven. That's less time than Steven was kidnapped for. That was less time that Steven had to endure with him. Now, Irvin Murphy, Parnell's accomplice, was sentenced to 5 years but was paroled after 2. Randall Poorman, the teenager hired to help abduct Timmy White, was sentenced to a term at a juvenile work camp. And Barbara, who was Steven's babysitter and Parnell's girlfriend, was never charged of any crimes. Now, Kenneth Parnell would eventually go back to jail in 2004. He was convicted of trying to buy a 4-year-old boy for $500, and this would land him 25 years to life. However, in 2008, while still incarcerated, Kenneth Parnell would die of natural causes at the age of 76. Now, after the trial, Steven was really struggling with everything going on around him. He wasn't only just dealing with the trial, but he was also being bullied and teased relentlessly by classmates. And it had gotten so bad that he eventually dropped out of school. He started drinking heavily, smoking a lot of pot, taking pills and doing other drugs. He had even crashed a few cars, and his mother would say that he was dating girl after girl after girl. Until eventually, Steven would meet a girl named Jody Edmonton that he had worked with at the butcher shop, and Jody would end up changing Steven's life. In June of 1985, Jody and Steven would get married, and they would have 2 kids named Ashley and Steven Jr. Jody would say that Steven was a great father, a great family man, and that it just really came natural to him. Steven had finally settled down and was even taking some law enforcement classes at the college in Merced when NBC would reach out to him and see if he wanted to make a movie about what had happened to him. And Steven would agree, and he would actually get a small role as a police officer. So in May of 1989, a 2-part miniseries called I Know My First Name is Steven would air, and it would actually go on to be nominated for 4 Emmys. However, on September 16, 1989, the night before the Emmys aired, Steven would be riding his motorcycle home on his way from work when a car would run a stop sign and pull out in front of him. Steven would end up crashing his bike, and sadly, at the age of 24, would pass away on the scene. Now, the little boy that Steven had saved, Timmy White, would be 14 at this time, and he would actually be a pallbearer at Steven's funeral. The story of Steven Stayner is really a sad one. After everything that had already happened to Steven and he was finally getting settled with his life, he had gotten married, he had had 2 kids, the Stayner family would now have to grieve the death of Steven. But 10 years later, in 1999, the family would find themselves in the headlines again when Cary Stayner would be found guilty of murder. So that was the first part of the Stayner brothers stories. I hope to see you next Friday when I cover Cary Stayner's story and the Yosemite Murders. Till next time, bye guys.